Close your eyes and imagine a medieval street at dawn. Cobblestones, still damp from the night's rain. The smell of smoke and spilled ale hanging heavy in the air. Church bells tolling in the distance, calling the faithful to prayer. But while townspeople shuffle toward markets or chapels, another figure slips quietly through the shadows, a woman, her dress brighter than those of the wives and widows around her, her eyes sharp, wary, practiced. She has survived another night in a world that both needs her and despises her, because she is a prostitute, one of the most visible yet invisible figures of the Middle Ages. And her story is one most history books skip over or sanitize. But tonight we're going to follow her through a day in her life. A life balanced between survival and shame, law and lawlessness, necessity and condemnation. And here's the question you should hold in your mind. How did a society that built soaring cathedrals, sang hymns of purity, and obsessed over sin, simultaneously license brothels, tax sex work, and tolerate what it publicly called evil? The answer reveals more about medieval hypocrisy and human nature than about her alone, because her survival tells us the truth about power, poverty, and desire in a world where morality was preached loudly but practiced quietly. We tend to imagine the Middle Ages as a place of knights, castles, and piety, but beneath those images lay hunger, desperation, and the unspoken economies that kept towns running. Prostitution was one of them. So when you think of her, don't think of scandal, think of survival. Don't think of sin, think of necessity. And don't imagine her only as a victim. Imagine her as a woman forced to turn society's hypocrisy into her livelihood. Because in her footsteps we see not only the contradictions of her time, but echoes of our own. Step into the crowded streets of a medieval town and you'll see the paradox immediately. On one side, stalls filled with bread, fish, cloth, the lifeblood of daily commerce. On the other, whispers follow women whose clothing marks them as different. Prostitutes were at once tolerated and shunned, visible yet erased. Society branded them as sinful while simultaneously relying on them. Priests thundered from pulpits that these women were gateways to hell, yet city councils quietly licensed their trade, calling it a necessary evil to protect wives and daughters from seduction. The hypocrisy was staggering. Men who condemned them publicly often visited them privately, and women who pretended disgust sometimes knew that without them, their own marriages might face different kinds of strain. Imagine living every day as a paradox, despised for what you did, but demanded for the very same reason. Children jeered at you, neighbors ignored you, yet local authorities saw your work as part of civic order, because if men could channel desire into controlled, taxed brothels, then chaos was contained. The prostitute became both scapegoat and solution, at once the problem and the cure. This stigma shaped every interaction. You were never allowed to forget your place. Clothing laws marked you, sermons damned you, gossip dogged you. But here's the irony. Your presence was not marginal, it was central. The entire city knew where the red light district was, who worked there, and what it meant. And though everyone looked down on you, they all knew someone who had visited. In this strange cultural balancing act, prostitutes became both the most condemned and the most indispensable women in medieval society. Survival required not just selling your body, but selling the illusion of silence, discretion, invisibility, while carrying the knowledge that every sneer aimed at you was also hiding a confession. In a way, they were living mirrors of medieval society itself, loud in its judgment, quiet in its indulgence. If you really want to understand medieval hypocrisy, you have to look at the law. Because while priests thundered about sin, town councils drafted ordinances turning sin into revenue. Prostitution wasn't erased, it was managed in London, Paris, Avignon, and countless other towns. Brothels were licensed, taxed, and often placed under municipal oversight. City fathers knew they couldn't stop it, so they tried to control it. In many places, prostitutes were required to live in specific districts, often called stews or bordellos, sometimes marked by lanterns, other times clustered around bathhouses, always conveniently near taverns where men already gathered. The idea was to contain vice, to channel it into a space where it could be supervised and, more importantly, taxed, because every transaction meant profit for the city, fines for those caught outside designated zones, fees for operating brothels, even clothing regulations designed not just to humiliate but to identify. Women were forbidden from wearing the garments of respectable wives, sometimes ordered to wear striped hoods, bright colors, or belts that marked their profession, so no one could mistake them. Law became branding, stigma sewn into every thread of their clothing, and yet the same officials enforcing these rules often showed up as customers. Here we see a society that didn't want to eliminate prostitution, only to control and profit from it, because eliminating it meant confronting male desire and poverty, and that was far more dangerous than keeping a taxed and segregated underclass of women who absorbed society's contradictions. In a way, these laws reveal how deeply woven sex work was into the urban fabric. It wasn't marginal, it was institutionalized, part of the civic economy, part of how cities ran themselves. The church thundered about morality while accepting the taxes that kept roads paved and watchmen paid. In the end, the law didn't protect prostitutes. It exposed them, forced them into districts where violence and exploitation were routine, left them vulnerable to every kind of abuse, while branding them as outcasts. They became both taxpayers and pariahs, indispensable and disposable. A contradiction written into parchment and enforced in alleyways. In the Middle Ages, clothing wasn't just fabric, it was identity. It told the world who you were, your class, your trade, even your virtue. And for prostitutes, the law made sure their clothing screamed their status before they ever opened their mouths. Across Europe, cities imposed regulations on what they could wear. Some required striped hoods, others forced bright or gaudy colors. In Florence, it might be yellow, in London striped sleeves. In certain French towns, a special belt. In others, a head covering that marked you instantly. The message was clear: respectable. Women wore modest gowns, muted colors, veils that signaled chastity. Prostitutes were forced into clothes that made them visible, identifiable, and permanently set apart. These garments were humiliation stitched into every seam, designed not to protect but to stigmatize. Imagine walking into a marketplace where everyone knew what your clothes meant: children pointing, wives sneering, men smirking, no way to pass unnoticed, no way to blend in. The clothing was your prison. And yet, there's another layer to this. Some prostitutes turned this forced visibility into a weapon. They leaned into the spectacle, adorning themselves with bright ribbons, perfumes, jewelry, amplifying the very thing meant to shame them. If society marked them as different, they would turn difference into a lure. If they were already condemned, why not at least profit from the gaze? And so clothing became both a chain and a strategy, both a mark of exclusion and a tool of attraction. It is a haunting reminder of how power can be stitched into fabric, how identity can be legislated not through words but through seams and dyes. And it shows us that while the law wanted to strip them of dignity, these women still found ways to manipulate the image to survive. Within Stigma, to transform cloth into survival. A day in the life of a medieval prostitute was not glamorous. It was survival dressed in candlelight and risk. Mornings often began not with rest, but with reckoning. Counting coins earned the night before, haggling with landlords, or bribing guards to look the other way. Breakfast might be bread and thin ale if there was money, or nothing if clients had been scarce. By midday she was already moving toward places where men gathered, taverns thick with smoke, bathhouses warm with steam, or street corners near markets where soldiers and merchants passed by. Her work was not only in the bed, but in the bargaining, because every transaction was a negotiation, a weighing of desperation against opportunity. A man might offer a few coins, she might hold out for more. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes hunger forced her to accept less. In brothels, the madam might control her schedule, demanding hours of waiting, smiling, performing charm whether she felt it or not. In the streets she was her own manager, hustling for attention but careful not to attract the wrath of guards, because being caught outside the stew district could mean fines or beatings. Encounters varied wildly, some quick and mechanical, others long and strange, some clients gentle, others violent, each moment a gamble, each choice one of survival. And behind the transactions there was always calculation. How to stay safe, how to avoid disease, how to stretch coins just far enough to cover food, rent, and perhaps a bit of ointment or perfume to keep up appearances. Evenings blurred into nights where the line between work and danger grew thin. Drunken men staggered from taverns, fights broke out, tempers snapped, and every whisper carried the threat of exposure or humiliation. Through it all she carried herself with a mask, a mixture of forced charm and practiced caution, because in this world her life depended not only on her body but on her ability to read a room, to anticipate danger, to turn rejection into opportunity. Survival was the real craft, not seduction, but endurance, not desire, but calculation. Her daily routine was not a performance of sin, but a choreography of survival. Step by careful step through a hostile city that both used her and despised her. Her clients came from every layer of medieval society, men who would never acknowledge her in daylight suddenly knocking at her door when the candles were lit. The shoemaker with rough hands, the weary soldier back from campaign, the merchant who spent the day haggling in the market, now haggling with her overprice. But also priests, scholars, even nobles, men cloaked in authority who spoke of morality in public and indulged in private. Each encounter brought its own texture. Some men arrived eager to boast, demanding attention as if they were kings. Others came quiet, ashamed, slipping coins into her palm without meeting her eyes. There were those who sought only quick relief, and those who lingered, spilling secrets after wine loosened their tongues. Secrets about trade routes, political alliances, even whispered confessions of crimes. She learned that her profession wasn't only about the body, but about listening, absorbing words that no one else was meant to hear. But with every client came risk. A man might refuse to pay, strike her, accuse her of theft. Knowing the law would not side with her, sometimes she was treated with fleeting kindness, a gentle hand, a shared laugh, but just as often with cruelty, disdain, or drunken violence. Each night was unpredictable. The dice of survival rolled over and over, and behind all this lingered disease, the invisible companion of her trade. No ointment or herbal tonic could fully guard against it. the work that sustained her body could also destroy it. Yet, through all this, she adapted, building strategies to read men quickly, to sense danger before it struck, to charm when necessary, to harden herself when survival demanded. Her encounters were not simply about pleasure or transaction. They were mirrors of society itself, exposing the double standards of men who condemned her with one hand and paid her with the other. Men who sought control in public and release in private. And in every whispered deal she became a witness to the contradictions of her world, knowing more than she was ever allowed to speak. If the brothel was the official stage of her trade, then taverns and bathhouses were the hidden marketplace, smoky, noisy, unpredictable places where desire and desperation mixed freely. Taverns were the easiest hunting ground, full of men with loosened tongues and loosened morals after cups of ale. Music and laughter covering the negotiations happening in corners. Sometimes she sang or danced to draw attention. Sometimes she simply leaned against the wall, letting her clothing do the advertising. It was loud, chaotic, dangerous, fights, breaking out with no warning, coins stolen in the shuffle, hands grabbing too freely. But the noise also gave cover, made deals easier to strike, made anonymity possible for men who didn't want to be seen stepping into the stew district. Baths were different, quieter, steamy spaces where business and pleasure blurred. Men came to relax, and women waited there. Offering more than just a rinse in hot water, steam became a cloak, concealing faces, softening boundaries. Transactions whispered over splashes. These places were tolerated, sometimes even owned by city officials, because they kept desire contained within walls while bringing in steady revenue. Yet both taverns and bathhouses carried their own dangers. Drunken men could become violent. Bathhouses were breeding grounds for disease. And in both spaces she walked a tightrope between opportunity and threat. Still, these were the spaces where she earned, where she built connections, where she became a fixture of the city's underworld economy. Invisible in daylight, yet indispensable. By night, the tavern and the bathhouse reveal just how woven her trade was into everyday life. Not pushed to the margins, but present in the heart of the town, in places everyone knew, places respectable citizens condemned in sermons but frequented in silence. And this proximity was the paradox. Vice lived right next to virtue, desire traded. Beside bread and fish, hypocrisy drinking from the same cup as survival. For every coin earned, there was a risk lurking in the shadows. Violence was constant. A client could turn from charming to brutal in the span of a heartbeat. Fists and knives were never far from the night, and she knew that if she cried out, help might not come, because the law didn't protect women like her. Guards might ignore her pleas, or worse, demand their own payment to intervene. She lived with the knowledge that her body was currency but also target. Disease haunted her like a shadow, no matter how careful, no matter how many herbal remedies or ointments she bought from apothecaries. No one fully escaped. Syphilis, fevers, infections, all spreading unchecked in bathhouses, alleys, brothels. Her body aged faster than her years, and each cough or sore was a reminder that her work was survival but also destruction. Beyond the physical dangers was the relentless sting of exclusion. She was unwelcome in churches, often barred from sacraments, sometimes forced into humiliating public penance. She was the woman everyone used but no one defended, the one society pretended to despise while depending on her labor to absorb desire and chaos. Isolation was perhaps the cruelest wound, watching other women marry, build households, become part of the fabric of the town, while she remained marked, visible yet untouchable. And when trouble came, when violence broke out, or clients refused to pay, she had little recourse. A life lived under constant threat, with no shield but her wits and her will. And yet, despite it all, she endured, adapted, survived longer than anyone expected. Her resilience was not celebrated, but necessary. Every step she took was a calculation. Every night survived was a small victory against a system designed to exploit and discard her. She carried the burden of danger in silence, her story etched not in stone or parchment but in scars. In exhaustion, in the resilience of women, history chose to forget. If there was one voice that never stopped condemning her, it was the church. Priests thundered from pulpits that she was the very embodiment of sin. Sermons painted her as a daughter of Eve, a temptress leading men toward damnation. Yet here's the contradiction: while the church condemned her, it also tolerated her, sometimes even relied on her. Theologians like Augustine argued that without prostitutes, society would descend into chaos, that their existence was a necessary evil to preserve the chastity of wives and virgins. Better for men to visit brothels than to corrupt respectable women. So while bishops preached purity, they also quietly allowed civic authorities to regulate, license, and tax her. Some monasteries even profited from brothel rents. A stunning hypocrisy cloaked in holy language. For her this meant she could never escape condemnation. No matter how discreet or obedient she was damned from the start, banned from many sacraments, sometimes forced to perform humiliating public penance, standing barefoot in the cold before crowds, ashes on her head while townsfolk jeered. Yet the same priests who forced her to kneel in shame were sometimes seen slipping through brothel doors under cover of night. The double standard was crushing: sin for her, indulgence for them, forgiveness for men, eternal stigma for women, religion weaponized against her while excusing those who paid her. Still, even within this contradiction, many women sought redemption later in life, turning to convents, hospitals, or charitable houses, trying to wash away the years of exclusion through repentance. And some were accepted, though never fully free of the stain of their past. The Church's stance reveals the medieval paradox. At its core, an institution obsessed with purity but unwilling to confront its own complicity, preaching holiness while institutionalizing hypocrisy. For her, it meant she walked every day beneath a cross of judgment, condemned not because she was uniquely sinful, but because society had decided her suffering was useful. Beneath the noise of taverns, the steam of bathhouses, the flicker of torchlight in alleys, there was a quieter reality. The weight she carried inside her, the psychological toll of a life where survival demanded silence, shame was stitched into her existence, not only because of what she did, but because of what society told her she was. She walked every street under the gaze of contempt, never allowed to forget that she was marked. Neighbors who would never speak her name, mothers who pulled children away from her shadow, priests who declared her unworthy of God's love. All these judgments accumulated, pressing into her like invisible chains. Isolation became her constant companion. Even among other women in the trade, there was competition, betrayal, mistrust. Bonds rarely lasted long because everyone was fighting. To survive, the loneliness was crushing. Her body shared with dozens of men, her spirit shared with no one. And yet she developed strategies to endure. She laughed when she had to, hardened herself when danger came, built layers of armor not from iron but from resilience, telling herself she was stronger than the whispers, that surviving another day was its own form of victory. Still, the scars were real. The nights when violence left her trembling, the mornings when hunger gnawed harder than shame, the ache of knowing that no matter how many coins she earned, she would never belong. And yet, here lies the paradox. The same society that condemned her also relied on her. She was excluded but indispensable, hated but necessary. Her resilience was never praised, but without it, towns and cities would have been different, less controlled, less moral by their own strange logic. Her endurance was a silent rebellion, a refusal to disappear, even when every voice told her she was nothing. For most women, prostitution was a trap with no easy escape. But history records a few doors, narrow and difficult, that offered the possibility of leaving. One path was through religion. Some women entered convents or charitable houses later in life, seeking to cleanse their past with vows of service. Hospitals run by nuns sometimes accepted them as penitent sisters. Though often with restrictions, they might live in separate quarters, always marked by what they had once been. Yet even with these conditions, it was a chance at dignity. Another path was charity. Wealthy patrons or guilds occasionally funded houses of refuge, where former prostitutes could live and work in modest trades, sewing, weaving, or serving the poor. These institutions offered a kind of social rehabilitation, though never without stigma. And then there was marriage, the most unpredictable escape. Some men widowers, laborers, even soldiers took prostitutes as wives, sometimes out of affection, sometimes simply because they needed a household partner. Such marriages were often precarious, subject to gossip and distrust, but they offered a way to re-enter the social fabric. For the woman, it meant trading one form of survival for another, always negotiating between dependence and independence. What ties all these exits together is the theme of repentance. Society never let her simply leave. She had to prove she was no longer who she once was. Redemption framed as atonement, even if her choices had been born of poverty rather than sin. And yet, the very existence of these paths tells us something crucial, despite all the condemnation. Medieval society knew it could not completely discard these women, that they deserved at least a narrow bridge back. Their survival stories remind us that redemption was never about morality alone. It was also about politics, charity, and the uneasy acknowledgement that even those condemned by society were still human, still worthy of some form of return. When we step back from the alleys and brothels, the taverns and bathhouses, what we see is not just the life of individual women, but the reflection of an entire society. Prostitution was not an accident on the margins of the medieval world. It was embedded in its structure. It tells us how cities functioned, how power was enforced, and how morality was negotiated. It shows us the gap between the ideals preached in pulpits and the realities lived in streets, where hunger and desire collided daily. The presence of licensed brothels, clothing laws, and public penance rituals reveal a system that managed rather than eradicated vice, turning it into a controlled, taxable, and publicly condemned but privately accepted institution. And in this contradiction lies the deeper truth. Medieval society needed prostitutes because they absorbed chaos. They carried the stigma so others could appear respectable. They embodied the sins men wanted but could not admit to, and in this way they became both scapegoats and safety valves. Their lives exposed the hypocrisy of a culture that sang hymns about purity while building systems to accommodate lust. They also reveal the brutal economics of survival, because most women did not choose this path out of desire but out of desperation. Widows, abandoned wives, poor daughters without dowries, They turned to it because society left them no other doors, so their legacy is also about resilience, about the ability of women to carve survival out of structures designed to discard them. When we study them, we don't just learn about medieval sex work. We learn about power, about double standards, about the mechanics of exclusion. Their legacy is a mirror that forces us to see how societies build hierarchies of worth, how some lives are branded disposable, and yet how even within that framework, women endured, adapted, and left behind traces of their existence, faint but undeniable. When we peel back the layers of shame, law, and survival that shaped the life of a medieval prostitute, we're not just looking at a distant past. We're looking into a mirror, because the questions her life raises are still with us today. Who gets judged for survival choices? Who gets condemned while others are excused? How often do societies build rules that punish the vulnerable while protecting the powerful? The medieval prostitute was called sinful, branded by her clothes, pushed into districts, yet men of wealth and status visited her freely. Their reputations left intact while hers was destroyed. Is that not the same double standard we see echoed in modern scandals, in the way gossip clings to women but excuses men? In the way poverty still drives people into choices that society condemns without understanding? Her story forces us to ask why survival is so often framed as sin, when poverty leaves no other path. And it reminds us that judgment is rarely about morality alone. It is about power, about who gets to set the rules and who is made to carry the shame. The lesson of her life is not that medieval people were uniquely hypocritical. It's that human societies are always wrestling with the same contradictions, preaching virtue while exploiting vice, condemning those at the bottom while protecting those at the top. And yet, in her endurance, we find something remarkable. She survived, she adapted, she endured in the face of contempt, and in doing so, she left behind a story that still matters, because it exposes not only the cruelty of her world, but the resilience of those forced to live within it. Her life is a reminder that behind every statistic, every law, every whispered judgment, there is a person carrying the weight, and the least we can do is see her not as an object of sin, but as a human being, surviving against impossible odds. And in that recognition lies the takeaways, that morality without compassion is just cruelty dressed in robes, and that if we truly wish to be better than the past, we must build a world where survival is not condemned but understood, where dignity is not conditional, and where no one is forced to carry society's hypocrisy on their shoulders alone.